Hello everybody. Today we're going to be addressing a fairly common issue with these vintage Gravely Model L garden tractors, and that is a leaking axle flange. Now, I bought this tractor a while ago at an auction, got it home, parked it in the garage, and immediately noticed that there was some oil leaking from underneath. And I was able to conclude that the left side axle flange is definitely leaking on this machine. Now, I'm talking about the flange that bolts directly to the transmission, not the outer flange with the axle seal in it, although the procedure is really going to be the same to fix that. So we've got the oil already drained out of the tractor. Let's go ahead and see what all is involved in repairing this. This project really requires nothing more than basic hand tools, some steel wool, maybe a little bit of brake cleaner, chemical cleaner, and some Permatex Forma gasket number 80019. To fix a leaking axle flange, you're actually going to have to take the entire axle assembly off the side of the tractor. Now, while that may sound a little intimidating, it's actually an extremely simple process. The first thing you need to do is drain the oil out of your machine. We've already done that off camera, so we're good there. Then we're going to have to jack up the side of the tractor that we need to work on. And I suppose you don't technically have to take the wheel off, but it's a whole lot easier if you do. If your tractor has a hitch, that's going to have to come off too, because the hitch attaches to the tractor using one of the bolts that goes through that axle flange that's leaking. So if your tractor has a hitch, it's easiest just to get that thing out of the way right from the start. That way you can slide your jack under the engine, jack the tractor off the ground. Now, just a little tip. In our case, we need to lift the left side of the tractor off the ground, so I'm going to slide my floor jack under the left side of the engine, and that's just going to lift up the left side of the tractor so we can work on it. The next thing you're probably going to want to do is remove that wheel and get it out of your way. And a word of caution here, if you have the old style hubs like this tractor does, where all 6 bolts hold the wheel onto the hub, you're going to want to deflate this tire first. And the easiest way I've found to do that is to just remove the valve stem. If you don't deflate the tire and you start taking those wheel bolts out, what's going to happen is the air pressure in the inner tube is going to split those two split rims apart. And it's going to try to ooze out between the split rims. It's just going to be a pain. You're going to have to deflate it and reset everything anyway, so just deflate the tire up front. If you've got the later style hubs where it's only every other bolt, there's only 3 of them that actually hold the wheel onto the hub, no need to deflate the tire there. Once the wheel is off the tractor, it's time to remove the 6 bolts holding the axle flange onto the transmission housing. And for this, you're going to use either a 3/4 inch wrench or a ratchet, your choice. But once all 6 bolts are removed, you could just slide the entire axle assembly right off the machine. And everything will come off in one complete unit. You don't have to worry about bearings or gears or Woodruff keys or anything like that falling off in the process. Everything just comes off intact, easy as can be. Now that we have the axle and the axle housing off, the first thing we're going to notice is that there's oil on this shim where the bottom bolt hole was at, and there's oil on that flange. So that is confirmation that it was leaking out of this axle flange. And we know it wasn't leaking out of that bottom bolt because unlike the right side of this transmission, the left side has not been modified to make that bottom bolt hole a drain plug. The top has been drilled out because it had to be for the Jenkins oil return, but the bottom's intact. So the only place that it could have been leaking was on that flange. The other thing that's important to note is that on these Model Ls, there are no gaskets on these axle flange. These are steel shims. And the purpose of these shims is to set the proper preload on these tapered bearings, the bearings against this tapered race. So Whatever shims come off, they've got to go right back on. And just out of convenience, since we have the axle and the axle flange off, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the sump area on this tractor and see if this is going to need to be cleaned out or not. And honestly, it looks pretty clean in there. I don't really see any issues. I don't see a bunch of sludge that I got to clean out. So that's one less thing that we're going to have to do. So let's move on to actually taking care of this oil leak. So I guess the question is, if there aren't any gaskets on this thing, how are we going to keep it from leaking oil? I mean, we could slather a bunch of RTV silicone on there, and I suppose that might work, but the problem is that RTV silicone is thick. What we're going to end up doing is creating a bunch of thin little silicone shims that are going to mess with this preload because it's going to space this housing out a little further than we want it. So what we're going to do is we're going to clean all of these surfaces, both sides of the shims, the flange, the transmission housing, and we're going to use something called Permatex Aviation Forma Gasket. It's part number 80019. If you watched my video on replacing the seals in a Gravely rotary plow, this is the same procedure. You're cleaning all the metal surfaces and you're going to use this stuff to seal it up. This is what this stuff is for. It's the same product that you'll use if you split the crankcase on one of these tractors. Anytime you have two machined metal surfaces that need to be sealed up together without a gasket, this is the stuff you use. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now we're going to use some steel wool and brake clean as needed to clean all of the mating surfaces, transmission housing, the axle flange, and both sides of all of the shims. Then we're going to treat all of those surfaces with a very thin coat of Permatex Forma gasket, sandwich them all back together, and reinstall the axle housing. With the axle assembly slid back into place, it's time to reinstall the bolts, all except the one that holds the hitch on, and tighten them down in an alternating pattern, just like putting a wheel on a car. You've probably noticed there's an oil line going to my top bolt, and that's because this tractor has a Jenkins overhead valve conversion on it, and that is one of the oil returns for the valve train. Your tractor probably just has a normal bolt there. So once the bolts are tightened down, it's probably not a bad idea to wipe up any extra sealant that oozed out in the process. Now the only things left to do are to reinstall the wheel, inflate the tire, lower the tractor back to the ground, and reinstall the hitch, making sure that you get that axle flange bolt where the hitch attaches nice and tight. Then pour the oil back in your tractor and enjoy the fact that it will not be leaking out of that axle flange again. Hopefully this video has helped you to tackle a common oil leak in these Gravely Model L tractors and showed you that this particular repair is actually a lot simpler than most folks might realize. Thank you again for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you on another episode.